All right, so the recording is started. Go ahead, John, and take it away, and I'm going to go off camera.
Okay. All right. Just quick comm checks. You can hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Wonderful. Hi. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Kerski, and today's presentation is going to be on commenting Power Query with Azure Open AI. And what we will cover today is what I like to do with this type of presentation is give you what a practical use case of using Azure Open AI from the perspective of somebody who does a lot of Power BI development or teams that do that. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll get an idea of like, well, maybe this particular use case is not practical for what I'm trying to do, but I could use this for this use case and see what the power of large language models and Azure OpenAI can do. So I'm going to present to you a challenge that the teams that I work with have on a day-to-day basis in managing Power BI projects. And that's around commenting Power Query, and then show you how we can work with Azure OpenAI to maybe help us overcome the challenge of commenting in Power Query. And then I'd like to spend some time going over the lessons learned with integrating Azure OpenAI with Power Query, but also showing you some lessons learned I had just working with large language models in general. And these lessons learned are things that I've applied not just with Power BI and Power Query, but working with large language models in general. So if you're getting familiarized with Copilot or working with Copilot Studio or ChatGPT, some of these lessons learned may be helpful for you, just applying these as kind of principles. So a little bit about me. I've been working in the Microsoft BI stack space for well over a decade, and a lot of where I come from my perspectives is born out of managing BI projects. And so I've got my project management professional certification. And so when I got into the field of Power BI, I noticed there was quite a few kind of deficiencies in terms of executing on projects and making sure that we could repeat our development capabilities, not have to babysit our reports, be able to maintain those Power BI products, and then hopefully hand them off to the next generation or the next team of folks that we're bringing on, and our teams could move on to other projects, or I could promote people to other projects and not have them stuck with babysitting these semantic models or having to spend an enormous amount of time training folks on those models. So for today, the slides that I presented and any of the code that I have linked to is available on the QR code I have. If you have any questions after the session and before we close this meeting out, you can always reach out to me on X or LinkedIn. And I also have a blog that these slides, there's these hyperlinks will take you to. And I try to blog every month about the concepts, one of those being the Azure OpenAI, but in general about the concept of data ops, which is working towards delivering your Power BI solutions in a much quicker fashion while reducing the number of errors that you might experience in production. And so that way your customers are happier and your team's happier because they get to build new things and there's less issues. So since we've got around 15 folks on the call, feel free to do a little raise your hand or come off mute and concur. But I'm always interested is, when working with Power Query, when you inherit models, I'm wondering if you all have ever had to make an update to a model and the first thing you see is a bunch of these like removed 1, removed 2, removed 3, or added custom 3. And you're like, oh no, I'm going to spend a lot of time clicking through each one of these in the model or in the Power Query steps just to try to understand what's going on. And that is, I see some hands raised. Usually when I'm presenting in front of folks in the audience, I get a lot of head nods. But this has been common for us in my teams when we're either inheriting models or we've worked on it for a while and we haven't been commenting our code. And the problem you run into with that is, as you're working with just one of these tables, you really don't understand what maybe like that merge queries happen. So you're gonna have to click on that merge query. And if you follow a gentleman named Chris Webb, who works for Microsoft, he has an extensive blog article about Power Query performance. And merges and sorts are some of the most expensive things that you can do in Power Query. So when you click on that merge, depending on how big your data set is, you might be waiting for that merge to finish, and then you can finally see what's going on. The same with removing columns. That's not necessarily a performance issue, but you got to click in it and then take a look at what maybe disappeared by looking at the Power Query step or the actual M code in the line to figure out what's going on. And then my favorite, and this is the one I usually do a poll the audience, but I think the highest number I saw the other day was in the 30s, added custom column 30, which was incredible to me. But you have to click on that as well to figure out what's going on. And every click on the Power Query applied steps is time. Either that's the time it takes for the data set to do the computation, not all of us have the most amazing machines, and sometimes it takes a little while to crunch that data. And that's time not spent on actually making changes to the Power BI semantic model. So what our teams have kind of embraced as part of our review process is commenting our Power Query code. And so let me show you a sample model that I have up here. So I'll try to zoom in as much as possible. But the idea is when we are training our new Power BI developers or folks who have been in Power BI for a while, but we want to get them used to our kind of design pattern, one of the first things that we teach them to do is when you're doing merge or doing any of the added custom columns, you can right click and go to properties. So if you right click on the step and go to properties, you'll get a little window that pops up and you can add a description. And so in this case, you could type in what you're merging the Marvel fact with the date dimension. And you'll notice that once I hit enter, this little icon appears. And that information icon, if you hover over it, actually takes that description and presents it to you. So instead of me actually having to click on that step, I could have just hovered there. So if I click on source here and I hover over it, it's still telling me what occurred. And for those of you who've been working with Power BI before and are familiar with the advanced editor, if you click on the advanced editor, you can see that comment actually gets placed right above the step. And so that's just the low code way of doing it. You could actually go through and add a comment that says, like, let's say expanded date dimension join. And if I hit done, you'll notice that now I've got two information icons right there. And so there's kind of two ways of doing that. We also, in our teams, we talk about not only adding comments in the merges, the removes, and the added custom columns, at least as a baseline. We also say, for like adding custom columns, it's nice to add a comment, but you can also right click on the properties. And in this case, I'm adding the date key to the table. I could just as well hit properties and say added date key column, and then say, added date key based on first appearance and year. And then if I hit OK, you'll notice that now this adds a little more context. And if I hover over, I can actually add more of a description, but I try to keep the applied step a little bit shorter, maybe less than 50 characters, because you can expand that out a little bit and get some space, but eventually that actually takes up some of the space that you want to see the columns with. And so when we work with our teams, this is the kind of the short kind of maintenance training that we'll go through. And when we do our peer reviews, we'll go through these tables and make sure that some of these columns and these steps have been properly documented. All right. Any questions about commenting? Anybody already follow these kind of steps? All right, Donald's got the thumbs up. All right. So with that, there's an inherent problem. So for most of us, we're either too busy or there's other cool stuff we could be doing, and commenting is quite boring. So when it comes to telling or training our staff, hey, let's comment the Power Query, they'd rather be doing something else. And then obviously in an environment that we work in business intelligence, there's always something else to be built. And so we'll often just delay or avoid doing that because that's not necessarily forward facing to the customer. It will hurt you a couple months from now when you go to look at that applied steps and then you're spending all that time trying to figure out what happened, or you pass it on to somebody else and they have to spend all that time trying to figure out what that table's doing and they need to make a change. But for the most part, it's that, instant gratification. Like I'd rather be working on something new. I'd rather not be commenting my Power Query code. And so often that becomes like what they call like technical debt, and then it never gets addressed. And so it's kind of perpetuating. You get new features and then you don't comment your code, and you get new features, you update Power Query and you don't comment your code. So what we took a look at on our teams was, once Azure OpenAI came out, we took a look at, well, could artificial intelligence, or more specifically, Azure OpenAI, help us comment the code, or at least set the baseline? We had worked with PowerShell and JavaScript and saw that large language models, either through Copilot for GitHub or just from our experience working with ChatGPT, looked like it could actually comment code pretty nicely. So we began to take a look at, all right, well, could it comment the code for us, and could it do it relatively cheaply? And one of the reasons we wanted to look at it relatively cheaply is we knew for some of our environments, Copilot or Fabric Copilot wasn't available, or it was cost prohibitive. I don't know if you've all looked at what the current cost is, and I imagine over time it may go down. But you're spending, I think, like $11 an hour, or well over $6 to $8 grand a month for Copilot for Fabric. And we wanted to just kind of cover the cost or be cheaper than the hourly rate. We wanted to pay a developer due to the commenting, because if we could have them have the large language model do it relatively cheaply, our developer could be doing something more productive that's more forward facing to the customer. So we took a look at artificial intelligence, and what I want to walk through, this will be less slide heavy here, I promise you, in a couple minutes, is we took a look at Azure OpenAI, and I want to walk you through how we have a template that we've shared on GitHub, and I want to walk you through how we set it up and give you an idea of how we're adding Power Query comments to our code thanks to Azure OpenAI. So first off, there is some prerequisites. You're going to need a premium back capacity to host your semantic model. Now, I've tested this out on premium per user, which is much cheaper, and a Fabric trial and a Fabric capacity, all works. What you need to make sure is that you have the XMLA endpoints turned on. In the documentation that I have on GitHub, it has a link, instructions, if you need to explain to a tenant admin or you're not familiar with that, turn that feature on. And then obviously you're going to need Azure OpenAI. Now, let me quickly go to the Edge browser here and show you that kind of experience, because it is a little different if this is the first time you're trying to set up Azure OpenAI in your tenant. So let me go to the website here. And so I would say, and I'll post in the chat window, if you've never worked with Azure OpenAI, there is a form that you have to fill out that is apply for access. If later on, I would imagine Microsoft's probably going to open this up, but for the time being with the Azure OpenAI service, even though it's generally available, they have this request form that you have to fill out, and you have to put in your name, you have to give your Azure subscription ID that you want to associate the Azure OpenAI service. So typically, if you've worked with Azure before, you go pick a VM and create a VM, or if you want to create a Fabric capacity, create a Fabric capacity. Well, if you click on Azure OpenAI, it's going to give you a link to this form to say, hey, fill this out, submit it, and then I would say relatively quickly. I think the longest I ever had to wait was maybe like 2 hours. The shortest I ever had to wait was like 15 minutes for a tenant. I got an email back that said, hey, you can create the Azure OpenAI now. And the way it looks like in Azure OpenAI, if you want to create it in Azure, just give me 1 second, is it's just an option where you can create an Azure OpenAI service. And you can pick your resource group, and you can give it a region, give it a name, and then I would imagine later on they'll have a different pricing tier, but right now it's a standard. One of the things I would recommend is when you name the name of your service, it's going to be the name of the API endpoint or part of the API endpoint that you're going to use to access the ChatGPT APIs. So just kind of keep that in mind. You don't want to run something too long. You want it to be very succinct. But once you create it, you'll get I'll go back to one that I have open already. So I've named it this, and you'll get an Azure OpenAI service, and then you can create the deployments, which I'll show you here in a second. But that's kind of the initial setup to getting Azure OpenAI in your tenant. You got to fill out the form. Once you've done it once for your tenant, you don't have to do it again. So if you want to create another Azure OpenAI service or add another deployment, you don't have to go and request Microsoft to allow you to do that for your tenant. All right, so let me jump back real quick to a visual aid of how this commenting Power Query will work. So the idea is that we'll have a semantic model sitting in a premium bag capacity or Fabric capacity, and we're going to leverage a data flow. And for the purposes of the demo, I have used a Dataflow Gen 1. We actually implement a version of this with Dataflow Gen 2, but I wanted to make it as accessible as possible for folks. So I have a Gen 1 version available. Power Query is going to interface with the semantic model and extract the M code. And I'll show you what that looks like. And then it's going to take that M code and ask Azure OpenAI through ChatGPT 4.0. This is what we've tested it with. And say, hey, can you comment this code? Can you look at this code and recommend what rename of the step should be? And then produce a report that we can use to build out or change our code. And I'll show you what that experience looks like. Now, if you're already kind of jumping ahead and thinking like, well, why would you do a report like this? Why don't you just have it update the M code automatically? You could. My recommendation is if you're going to go down that road of just having the code automatically update, make sure you have good tests in place. ChatGPT and these large language models will update certain parts of the code if you don't do this correctly. And if you're not testing, you always want to test to make sure that any change you make isn't reflecting poorly in terms of the performance as well as affecting what the schema is of that table. So for the demo and for what I provide you, it will create a report that you can then take the M code and bring it into your environment. And I'll show you what that looks like. All right. The link in the slides will take you to the instructions. So a lot of what I go over today, I know will be recorded, but I also have a README file that walks you through setting this up in your own environment. All right, so let's go back to Edge. And so I've got a Azure OpenAI service. What I need to do next is deploy a model. And in the Azure OpenAI service, there is a model deployment area. And I click on that. There's another lovely button, which I hope they fix this experience, because it seems like you're clicking on a lot of buttons just to get to another screen. This is going to take you to Azure OpenAI Studio. Wait for that to load. All right. So you can see here, I've actually got a listing of the deployments already. But if you were to create, or this is your first time, you can create a deployment. So what I've just done here is clicked on Create New Deployment, and then pick the model. 4 is the one we tested it with. We've begun testing in 4.0, but I haven't recommended it yet, just to run it through a couple different models. So you can click on 4, and then you can choose. This changes. So even, if you're doing this a week from now, you might see a different model version that's available. I've used the default just because it's not preview. And so if I pick that, there's a standard, there's a provision managed, and then you'll give it a deployment name. Now that name is also going to be used to make up the URL. So just keep that in mind as you're building it out. I did the PBI-4 so that it was very short and I could build the URL out. And then you can update the limit in terms of how many tokens per minute you can request the API. So as an API service, roughly every 4 characters of text that you send over the wire as part of a prompt to ChatGPT counts as a token. So if you're doing this a lot in a short amount of time, you could hit that limit, but you can actually raise the throttle here. What's nice about this is you can kind of control it if you're sharing this API with other folks in your development team and you don't want them to really break the bank. Honestly, the amount of money I spend on the tokens is actually not that much. For one of the larger models that I've run this through, I think I've spent $10. And when you think about how much you charge or are paying somebody to comment for an hourly rate, it's pretty cheap. But the nice thing is you're only going to pay for the amount of text you send over the wire and how much text you get back. So the token's roughly 4 characters, just something to keep in mind, but you can throttle that as you see fit. And so once you hit the create button, you'll get a deployment like this. And you'll get a listing of when it was created, the model, what your rate limit is, and then you can actually go and open it in the playground. There's a playground here too. You can click on chat and you can pick which model you want to use in the chat. So before I even touched any of the Power Query code that I wanted to comment, I took some of it and used the chat here to develop my prompts. And so this is the nice kind of development area to test your prompts out and make sure you're getting what you want before you start touching Power Query. Because once you get into Power Query, then you got to integrate it. And I wanted to separate each one of those variables out. So I was just really testing, can I get it to comment the way I want it to? Can I give it the user variable that I wanted it to? And so the chat feature here was really a good test bed for working with it. So once I've built the prompts, then it was time to move over to trying to integrate it with Power Query. And so what I'm going to show you here is a workspace that I have, and it has a data flow here, and I've got a semantic model and a report. The semantic model actually leverages that data flow data. So the data flow goes into the semantic model, and then the report actually shows the updated code that I can bring into my model. So I'm going to crack open the data flow. Of course, it says sessions expired. So we're going to give it just a second to load here. And I'll try to zoom in as much as possible. Now, again, this is a template that comes with the GitHub page that I have in the URL that you can download this, and I walk you through how to upload it to your workspace. But so let's talk a little bit about some of the parameters that we have here. So first off, I have a workspace server setting. So as I talked about it in the visual, we need to connect to the semantic model somehow, and we need to do that through XMLA. Well, in order to do that, if I go back to Power BI, the way I can go about doing that is if I go to a workspace, and that's got the semantic model that I want to run through and comment for me. So this is the sample model here in the service. If I go to workspace settings and I go to the premium button and I scroll down, you'll see that there is the workspace connection. So I copy that and brought that into the data flow. So that's how I came up with that XMLA endpoint. And then the next one is just naming the semantic model. And I have a flag here for whether or not we're working in development or not. So I'm going to switch that to true for the purpose of this demo. Now, the reason I have this flag in place is every time I'm making that round trip to Azure OpenAI, I'm putting money in that Microsoft jar. And so if I'm trying to still test this out, or I want to see what the effects are, I'll set it to true, so that way I'm restricting the number of tables or lines of Power Query code I want it to actually talk to ChatGPT. So this is kind of the debug mode, and avoids, if I've got 50 tables in my semantic model, having the data flow try to go through the semantic model 50 times and go and call Azure OpenAI, because that's money that's going out the door. I'd rather just work with maybe a smaller subset of the data and figure out and make sure Power Query was working. So that's why those flags are in there. So I've pointed it to the semantic model I want. I've set is dev true as if I want to debug it. And then for Azure OpenAI, and don't worry, I will change this API key after we're off this call. But I want to show you what the API looks like here. So the name of the resource that I created is what the prefix is. And then this is all static. This doesn't change. That's so there's not like a general URL for your API call to ChatGPT. It's specific to the Azure environment that you're working in. So I've got the resource, and then the name of the deployment is specific to that deployment that I created in the name that I gave it. At that point, you've got the static, which is pointing it to a version of the API. So the chat window that I showed you, where I was working with it manually, where I could put my prompts in and get response back, I can actually do this through an API call as well. I can send it a prompt and get a response back. And so this is the API to do that. And then I've got the key, which if you've never worked with Azure before, if I hit the back button, I'm gonna have to hit the back button a few times, but the keys sit here, and this is where you would grab those keys. Now, one thing I will point out from a security perspective, the data flow should be only accessible to the folks that you need on your team and should have access to Azure OpenAI, because that key can be used by anybody to if they have access to the key and they know the URL, they can use Azure OpenAI on your behalf, and you don't want that. You want to restrict access. Near the end of these slides, I do have a link to a Fabric idea. I don't know why in Dataflow Gen 2 and Dataflow Gen 1 we can't use Azure Key Vault to work with APIs and pull this information in, so that it is secure. You can do it with notebooks. You can do it in Azure DevOps. You can do it with a whole host of other products in the Azure suite. But Power Query just has been left to have this opening where you have to make sure that you protect the artifact, which in this case is the data flow. But this is probably the best way to do it, other than putting it if you put in a data set, data sets can be shared because it's a PBX file and get emailed around, and then that key is open. Better to have it in the data flow. So I've got these parameters. So I'm connecting to, I've got the parameters set up to connect to the model. I've got the parameters set up to connect to the Azure OpenAI. Now let's talk about connecting to the model. So in order to do that, we have to leverage the XMLA endpoint and a set of queries called that are part of the dynamic management view. This is something that's come from the analysis services realm, but there's a way that you can pull metadata out of your semantic model, your data set, remotely. And so if I send this query called discover calc dependencies, I can actually get some of the M code from the model. And I always forget which one is which, but you have to issue one query to get all the M code that is shown publicly in the model. And then anything that has that unchecked enabled or kind of hidden, and you use maybe as temporary tables to build the final table, you have to issue another query, which is M expressions, discover M expressions, to get everything together. And so what you see in here is there's the M expressions not loaded into the data set. And you'll see that we're using the M expression query to get that. So if I zoom in, that same code is the M code that if I pull up the semantic model, see that's disabled. Right there, that's disabled. And if I right click on Advanced Editor, that's the M code. And so it should match what we have in the expression here. And so this is a way that we can get the M code out, because once we have the M code, then we're in good shape. The next thing is, all right, now that we have the M code, one of the things I have to do is split that M code up. So line by line. And so why would we do that? Well, later on when I go over the lessons learned, I can go into detail. You may, depending on the size of your table's M code or the Power Query code that's used to generate that table, you may hit the token limit. And for some of the tables I worked with, I actually hit that early on. And so what I learned is if I can break up the code into smaller chunks, and really every line in itself is probably enough context that I can ask ChatGPT to comment, then I wouldn't hit that token limit or I wouldn't get throttled. And so that was something I learned as a lesson. So I would have to break up the M code. So we break up the M code. And then once the M code's broken out, so I can show you here. Let's see. And if you haven't noticed already, we ran the same data flow through the commenter as well. So we can kind of figure out whether it's a comment or not, or take a look at the code in itself. So what it's doing here is it's breaking every line of code up. And so that way I can feed that line of code to ChatGPT. And so what am I going to ask ChatGPT to do? So I've got that line of code. What am I going to ask it to do? Well, in the Azure OpenAI area here, we have a prompt. And this is the prompt that we worked with in the development area. And what I learned early on is you really have to kind of set the stage for ChatGPT. So the first line is really getting ChatGPT aware of what I want it to do. And so I'm asking it to be an assistant that's going to comment the code. And then I'm going to ask it to take the code, but I'm going to give it a very specific marker. Now, one of the things I learned from some of the training I took, and I'll give you links to that, is to make sure to denote what is actually the code that you want ChatGPT to look at. And so the 3 ticks was something they recommended. And so I say, please take the code between the 3 ticks. And so that way it understands, oh, that's the code. I don't need to try to figure out if there's any other text there and parse it. And then ChatGPT, at least 4, is really good at bulleted lists. And so I tell it to do return a comment explaining what the piece of code is doing. Do not start the comment with the word step or number. Early on, as I'm iterating through these comments, it was giving like step 1 or going like a number there. And I really didn't want to put a number there. I wanted to just start writing what the code means. And then do not copy the code into the comment. As I was debugging, went through the chat, it would sometimes ChatGPT would just take that M code and then just put it in the comment. So it was just like doubling it and putting a comment in front of it, which wasn't helpful at all. I needed it to be in plain English, at least for me, so I can understand it or my team could understand it. And then also I needed to bound the response back to a certain number of characters. And this is something that the training I took said, hey, this is a best practice. 1, to make sure you don't hit the token limit, but 2, to get back exactly what you want in certain parameters. Because if you ask ChatGPT for a dissertation, it will give you a dissertation up until you hit that token limit. If you just want it to give you 225 characters, you ask for it, it will try to maintain 225 characters or less. And then here is a placeholder where I replace the M code. And so in Power Query, I just swap out the M code in that little placeholder there and send this prompt over the wire. And if I go back to the step here, give it a second, it's running in development mode. So it shouldn't take too long to run. There we go. You'll see I've got the line of code. Here is the prompt that has been specifically designed with the code in it. And I've called ChatGPT to give me the comment. And so it says this code transfers the date column in the source table to a date data type. I mean, probably something I would have written, pretty decent. So ChatGPT does a really good job of commenting the code. So how did I actually go out and ask ChatGPT to do it in Power Query? Well, there's a set of functions I've written called prompt Azure Open AI. And let me open up in the advanced editor so I can walk you through this a little bit. So this is looking at the parameter for the API endpoint. This is the API key. And I give it the headers. You got to pass the API key in the headers. And then in what ChatGPT expects in Azure Open AI or the API endpoint is you give it a JSON body and you take your prompt and assign it to the content property. And then I use the web.contents function in Power Query to go ahead and make the API request. And then I just parse the JSON response. And so this serves as just a wrapper for the API call in Power Query. And then I use that wrapper to do fn get comment or get a variable suggestion for the step name. And so the prompt piece was probably the most difficult piece. The other one that took a little doing was just figuring out the API call. And at that point, if I've got the parsed comments, I also can reach out and ask ChatGPT to give me suggested variable names. And what that does is it uses this prompt. and I won't spend too much time on this one, but the only difference is just some of the instructions at the end. I want to make sure that the variable name should always start with a verb in the past tense. I can say, make sure you put some spaces in the words, make sure to keep the characters to about 50, and make sure you put it around double quotes. Because in Power Query, if you give a variable name that has a space in it, you need to put double quotes around it with a pound sign in the front. That's just the format that Power Query wants. And so I've got another table that splits out the M code and does the same thing, passes that line of M code over and asks it what can you do? And here's the names that it gives for the source, the change type. And then you'll notice I had to put little numbers at the end of it. And the reason did that is when we break out that M code, we need to index it because I need to know that's line 1, that's line 2, that's line 3. And Power Query, unless you buffer or you tell it to do so, it's going to try to parallelize the work. So if you try to join the code back together and has some semblance of code that works, it has to be in the right order. Otherwise, you won't have M code that's in the right order. Okay, so with that, I've got the Power Query code transformed. And I have just basically the output is 2 tables. I've got the table name and the M expression with comments. And so you can see just combine the code where the comments are now there and the source codes is there. And then I have an alternative where it actually swaps out the name. So instead of saying source, it says decompress and transform binary to a table. And so I've got the transform code, and then I also have a table of what the before is. So Power Query code is the before, and Power Query code transform is the after. And so when I run this, it takes a couple minutes depending on how big your model is, but some of the larger models I've worked with can take 10, 15 minutes, but you think about the time you'd spend going through each table to comment the code, 10, 15 minutes is nothing. You can go work on something else. And now I've got a data flow, and what I've set up for the template is you can download a template here, PBIT file, and if you open up that template, it's going to ask you what the workspace is and what the data flow is. And what this does is if I put this in correctly, and the way you do that is you'll go to your data flow. So up at the top here, that's your workspace ID. That's your data flow ID. So you can take that. I'm going to go over and paste it. I'm going to go back, grab the data flow ID. Put in the load, and then hopefully this actually runs in a relatively quick fashion. I know we're showing this over Teams and I've got other stuff running. I do have this already preset if it takes a second, but it's going to go out to the data flow and pull in the results of the comments. So now if I go back to, looks like it loaded, just taking a second. Taking a little bit longer than I normally like, but this report you can pick the table, and then you can see on the left is the original Power Query code, and on the right is your choice on the enhancements. So you can just pick, I'd like just the additional comments. You can see what that looks like, or you can do additional comments and variable name changes. And so what our team does is we'll take, let's say, alignment dim, and you can hover over the additional comments. I can copy that value. So again, what I did is I'll right click, copy value, and I'll go back to that sample model that I was working with. And I'll duplicate that table. Reason you want to do that is if you're going to change Power Query code and you don't have tests in place, the best way to do is maybe compare the schemas. So I'm just going to right click, go to Advanced Editor, select all, Control V. And now if I toggle the two, you'll see the table's the same, but the old version has this, the new version has the comments now. And now instead of having to click on everything, I can actually read what those comments are doing. And if I like the comments and I want to add in the variable names, I could just go back, click here, change the setting for add comments and variable names, copy that value, go back, go to the advanced editor, copy and paste. And now I've got a set of code that has the variable name changes as well. So I can see, oh, I replaced the missing values in the alignment column there. Or if I'm looking for where I added the index, it's right there. I don't have to click on each one to try to figure it out. The Power Query code's been commented for me. And so our teams have been leveraging this for the data models that we've been building, or even the ones that we inherit. We'll point it to that semantic model and say, hey, can you comment that for me? And then I can use that report to try to understand what is actually happening in those tables. So ChatGPT is helping me understand the model without actually having to open and click on each thing and take the time for the processing of the merges and the sorts to actually work with the data.
Hey, John, while you're right here, I got a question.
Sure.
So now with that alignment dim, and you got alignment dim bracket or parentheses too.
Yeah.
So you like that. Which way do you do it now? Do you go back into alignment dim and paste back in the final thing that you like, or do you do a rename and delete the old one?
Great question. And you probably know the answer. So you don't do the rename. Yeah, you go to advanced editor, copy that code, and you go back to the alignment dim here. Because under the hood, what Power Query actually, or Power BI does, is each of these tables has a unique identifier. And so if you delete that table and you rename the other one, you're actually going to break any relationships you have in the model. And so the alignment dim 2 just kind of serves as your test bed to make sure everything's good. And then in the alignment dim, you can just copy and paste when you're done. And so now I've got these two are identical, should be identical. And then I can just delete this. And then your model won't be broken.
Yep. Yeah, that I have made that mistake before. So
We all have. It's one of those things I don't think they tell you in any of the documentation either.
no, because you're like, all I did, I
What's,
got a whole nother one. It's the same name. But you're right,
yeah,
there's some, either a GUID or some other tracking behind it. So
yeah, that links everything up and then it breaks when you do it. Yeah, made that mistake before. So good, great question. All right. So I wanted to move on to lessons learned, but before I do, I'm interested in any questions on the implementation or the prompts. All right.
nothing in the chat. So doing great.
Okay, so let's talk a little about lessons learned. So the first lessons learned I had was don't write prompts unless you take this ChatGPT prompt engineering for developers. And I have the link here. Shrink this. And I'll post this in. It's free still. But this is a wonderful beginner's introduction to writing prompts as a developer. And they give you how to do it, how to develop prompts, and you work with it in Python. But the writing of the prompts just in English. But they give you techniques on like how you should be interacting with these large language models, and it's for free. And so a lot of the frustrations I had early on working with ChatGPT, watch this video and it gives you some good techniques. I liken it to a little more advanced training to, and this might be dating myself, but when we first started working with search engines, you had to learn how to write the prompt for the search engine to get the search results back that you wanted. And so this is the same thing, it's just a little more advanced. And with following that, I learned how to set premise and use marker indicators or set boundaries. I've also learned recently that being polite actually looks large language models through, I guess, the vectors will actually pull content that's probably less explicit because that's what polite context has. And so you actually get less chance of having explicit or unwanted text coming back. So being polite is also helpful, but also being very prescriptive in the steps that you take and setting those boundaries was something that this training helped me understand. And it's still, even with its advancements to 4 and 4.0, there's a lot of these things that are still around. Maybe 5 years from now, and large language models advance to understand context even better, could be great. But this is a wonderful course that I would recommend. The other one that I learned very early on is token limits. Now, maybe down the road, this won't be an issue because the token limits keep getting lifted. But Microsoft actually has documentation for each one of the deployment models. There is a limit to the amount of tokens you can hit. And so, for example, if I'm working with a large language model that has an 8,000 token limit, the prompt plus the M code I was sending over counts towards that token limit. But the response also counts towards that. So the traffic to and the traffic back gets grouped together in the token limit. So if I'm already sending a large amount of M code over, and then I'm asking it to send back the M code plus the comments, very early on, I was hit some of those token limits. And so this led me to be aware of those token limits and look at some strategies for token limits. And I have this link in the documentation or in the slide deck, but it took me to this gentleman's website, or he's got these techniques that he goes over on different patterns for breaking up your code or your text and working with large language models to get around those token limits. And there's different techniques involved. And so for Power Query, I could break it up very easily. But if you're working with, like, let's say you wanted large language models to summarize a dissertation, well, if you break it up too much, you might lose context. Or if you break it up too little, you'll hit the token limit. So this gentleman, Greg, runs through some different techniques that, depending on the size of text you're working on, here's how you can design your deployment strategies or your prompting strategies to get around those token limits. So I found that really helpful as well. The other thing I learned is don't just jump to the next model just because it's fancy. One of the things that I came across with just testing out 4.0 is one of the prompts is actually, it's more verbose. And in 3.5 and 4, if I asked it to give me a variable name, it gave me a variable name. And I told it to only give me 50 characters back. Well, 4.0, for some reason, the prompt is the same, but it's giving me a bunch of steps and explaining what it did, which is kind of verbatim to what I asked it to do. And so for 4.0, it's faster. I've noticed it's been faster. We've kind of benchmarked it, but I have to go through and adjust the prompts accordingly. And so one of the things you definitely want to think about when you're working with these APIs is it's really no different than working with other APIs. Is you change the model, you need to test for it, because the prompt that you had with one version may not give you the same results that you work on with the next version. And this is why you test these things out and make sure that things work. Just don't switch to the next version and just think, oh, everything should be good. Learn that lesson early on. Well, not early on, just recently, actually. Sorry. I went to 4. I was like, oh, I'll try it out. The prompt was not working. So we're spending some time to update it. I'm going to try to get it working for 4.0, but 4 is working just fine. 3.5 is working as well. Okay. Other things to consider with large language models and AI. I know there's a lot of talk about security. Microsoft has a whole site dedicated to explaining how your data is used with the Azure OpenAI service. And one of the reasons we were interested in using Azure OpenAI service versus any other large language model services is the data stayed in the Azure tenant. It wasn't used for training. And Microsoft goes in at length, if you got to send it to your lawyers or your general counsel on what they're going to do with your data if you're sending it over to the API in your Azure data center. And then finally, on these 2 points from lessons learned, if you don't mind voting for this idea, I really think that keys, especially if we're using post requests and web.contents, do need the ability to connect to Azure Key Vault. All the other tools that we have out there, Fabric Notebooks, Azure Data Factory, can leverage Key Vault. I don't know why Power Query can't. This should be a capability that needs to be added. And then if you've seen all this and said, well, why doesn't just Copilot for Fabric do it? It should. I mean, there should be maybe some easier ways for it to comment the code for you. And this is another Fabric idea that's out there. I know eventually Microsoft's going to have a version of this publicly that probably will comment the code. It's depending on the cost. And for right now, our teams, we work, with sometimes thin margins, and Azure OpenAI does this at $10 a semantic model versus paying the $11 an hourly rate, $8,000 a month or $6,000 to $8,000 a month on the premium capacity. It's still cheaper. The other thing, if you work in the government community cloud, Fabric isn't available. So I can't even use Copilot for Fabric, but Azure OpenAI is. So this is something we've been able to leverage and something to think about as the product matures or the availability, depending on what tenants you work in. And if you have sovereign tenant issues, I wouldn't say issues, but availability of certain features. So with that, Kevin, I think that's the end of the presentation.
Yeah, it was great. I'll leave the recording on for just a minute. I'm gonna have my camera change Zoom again. It's weird. Anybody have any questions? They want to come off mute and ask John?
Excellent, John. Thank you very much. It needs a little practice now to implement it and follow all the steps.
I'm sorry, the question you had there, Fernando?
He's wondering, to implement all the steps, did it, even with everything that I'm going to ask the question 2 ways. With everything you provide, how much more practice do you think it would take, effort? And also, what was the kind of I think you covered a little bit, some of the practice and trial and error you did even to come up to this point.
Yeah, so once I figured out how to implement it, us switching the models was just change of parameters. So the setup in an environment takes less than an hour. I probably wait longer in a tenant for Microsoft to give me the ability to create Azure OpenAI than I do to set everything up. That said, it took me a good couple weeks after I took that initial training. Like, I got a little frustrated, took the training, came back, and then it took me about a week or 2 to get the first version working the way I wanted it to. So that's definitely was probably the longest part, was just trying to figure out how to prompt. I was fortunate. I've worked with a number of APIs in Power Query before, so figuring out how to interact with the API through the web.contents function wasn't terribly difficult. But the prompting and figuring out the API URL and everything, that took a little time. Thankfully, with the API key, I didn't have to figure out OAuth authentication either, which is, I know it's a whole hassle in itself. So it definitely took 2 weeks to try to figure out, how do I get the M code out? How do I prompt it? And how do I finally get what I want and then combine it back so that it's a coherent set of M code?
Mm-hmm.
And then once that was in place, we kind of wrote the instructions out. And then for our teams, we got a couple workspaces just dedicated to pointing it to a semantic model, running the refresh, and then waiting for it to finish, and then take the results.
So is it fair to say, with everything that you provide in the the slides and your blog, I think in your GitHub and everything, if somebody they didn't even have Azure AI set up yet, all of that different stuff, probably a few hours for somebody to take this from you and get it set up in their environment.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I do try to go through, make sure you got all the prerequisites set up with links, especially if you got to go and for large enterprises, sometimes you got to ask somebody else to do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
So I got the link, like, here's the Microsoft documentation, do this. And then I walk you through how to install the data flow, how to set the parameters, some of the prompts you're going to get to make the connections, how to get the workspace IDs, how to set up the template, and then some of the other security considerations. So that's probably a fair estimate.
For me, it's 3 days because I get squirreled. So it's like, oh, wait, I'm going to read through this. Wait, what did he do there? And yeah, so no, I'm kidding. But yeah, I would imagine and you could probably get it all done within a few hours, less than a day, even if you get a little bit squirreled. So
yeah,
Fernando, we expect to hear it on Saturday that you have it set up.
Yeah, you're running it.
Well, I do have the Azure Open AI already. I requested it. I had it.
Nice.
Well, I've also opened this and made this kind of open source under MIT license, because I'm always interested if you got better prompts or there's tweaks. I'm all ears, because I, even as 4.0 comes out, I'm sure there's little techniques that probably get better results. And that's something I've learned. Even with the prompt that I have, we've gone through a couple of iterations internally, and then we're like, oh, well, let's publish the new version and test it out, make sure it works. But it was like, well, we need to add this tweak, or we added a new model, and now we got to add another little caveat to what it should return.
So then if it saves your developer time, but it still costs you $10 to get a model documented, do you add a margin to it and turn around and bill it?
Or it's charged back for using the service, depending
there
on
you go.
depending on whose tenant you're using it in, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So
any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna take the recording off.